Alright, what's up y'all? Today we are doing a very impromptu Salon event here at the Gruber AI Sandbox with me, this guy, and then this guy you might know, Dr. William Hahn. Introduce yourself.
Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks everybody for coming in person.
Yes.
We're excited to kind of kick off this series and embrace our grand opening of our AI Sandbox this semester.
How many of you have heard of this thing called synesthesia? What is your idea of what synesthesia is? Kareem. Our special repeat guest.
I believe you had mentioned it in your original video,
Yeah.
which was talking about whether plants are actually agents.
Yes.
Is that correct?
This is related, but this is not the synesthesia thing specifically.
I think I'll let someone else start the conversation.
Well, maybe let's start. Does anyone have synesthesia?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the number 3 is yellow.
Oh, that's what it is? Then
Yeah.
I have it, yeah.
Okay. And now everyone's
Is your three also yellow?
My 3's green.
Your three's green.
My three.
Yeah. My 1's red, my 2's blue. It's very simple.
Okay. So synesthesia is basically this idea that you're associating, shapes with feelings or numbers or colors. There's these cross associations and mixing between senses. So some people can hear colors, they'll see sounds, they'll have all these types of things. And if you spend a lot of time online, you'll hear lots of stories of very, very wild examples of what this can turn into. And I think all of you probably know what language is, but I want to hear somebody's definition of what language is. Who wants to take a shot at it?
Well, first a question, actually. In synesthesia, is the association always the same? Do you always associate a number with a certain smell or color?
No, it can change. And it seems it can change in people's lifetime and also in response to certain stressors, activities, substances, all that type of stuff. But even amongst synesthesia literature, there are various different kinds of synesthesia, different associations, right? So there are shapes and color and sound and emotion and texture associations. There's all these different types of things. You can get a very wide range of mixes.
Although there are non-trivial sort of groupings that exist across people.
Yeah. But so what is the general consensus of when you guys think of language? What is language in your perspective?
Well, I think that it's an abstract representation of a concrete object. Like human language encodes information on various physical phenomena. Biological languages encode things like, for example, proteins, maybe even the neural networks in your brain are another way to encode physical information. Essentially an abstract representation of something in a different space.
So what you're saying is on this wine bottle here, this Moscato thing, right? The camera can't see it, but you'll have to believe that I'm showing it. So Moscato, right? Why is it that those shapes on that slice of dead tree on that heated glass tells you it's a wine bottle, if you didn't know? Because those are just shapes and colors.
Well, those are features.
You turn it around. So that's what I'm talking about.
Those are features.
Yes.
And those features are in the space of colors, in the space of colors creating shapes, which create higher level features until you get to the highest level, a level high enough for it to be a wine bottle.
Do they have to be colors and shapes?
I mean, the wine bottle in a different space would be like the word wine bottle, or even like the word, alcohol. So that would be the wine bottle in a different space other than the space of my vision.
What about David?
I thought it's more of an abstract means of communication and expression, and it does not necessarily have to be verbal.
I take the abstract out altogether. I don't think language is inherently abstract. I mean, there's a sense in which when we're talking about language, we're talking about it in the abstract. But language is just a set of rules for communicating with a set of underlying tokens, right, or symbols. It doesn't matter what those symbols are, what kind of symbols they are.
Yeah,
And it has both grammar, right, syntax and semantics.
What other ways could the wine bottle be described and represented?
I mean, I would think of like any like structure which is holding like wine and is some Actually, would it have to be transparent? Wait, it's not logic. You could have an oak barrel filled with wine and call it a wine bottle.
You could. Makes
Yeah,
sense.
old wine bottles were clay.
Or a wineskin.
Oh, yeah, wineskins.
I think anything with this shape people associate with wine,
Or alcohol. Like it could be any kind of
like a
alcohol.
soju. But
Or ketchup.
yeah, I feel like when it's longer, it's usually associated with wine.
But I think they're asking you, how do you know that? Why do you think
well,
that?
I think over time we learn to associate certain shapes with, like a meaning. For example, like wine. Like this shape, I've learned to associate over time with wine or alcohol.
And what is sort of the experiential aspect of meaning in your head? I'm actually not even going to say brain. I'm going to say mind. I'm going to
Mind.
very specifically not say brain. I'm going to say mind. Right? Like what actually constructs that idea of a meaning, that feeling of a meaning in your head?
Probably memory or like reinforced learning.
Any other takers?
I think it's a qualia associated with abstract thoughts, if I had to guess.
Why is it that you can have a wine bottle and I can have many, many different languages describe it using different forms of letters and shapes and sounds? There's the famous click language. There might be something called an olfactory language, a small language that we'll get into later. Could you represent that wine using musical notation and make a song that's describing all the aspects of that wine in a very predictable way?
You can, as long as you define it.
Yes.
Do you have to define it?
Oh, you could jump to. You guys have heard of con languages, right?
Conlangs, yeah.
You want to explain it?
I think there's like a programming version of these code call. I'm probably botching the term. You guys can correct me. But essentially, you can create these like custom programming language. Like there's these like programming competitions where you have to create like code which does a certain task in the minimum amount of like instructions.
So that's the golf idea.
Yeah.
Right.
But you could create your own programming language where the default action, where when you don't write any code whatsoever, is performing like a certain program, and you could like basically use these like programming languages. Might be using the wrong term. There's like billions of different ways you could encode like a single like the same program in different languages. So it's not like, it seems to be a very common and general property, and like as far as I'm concerned.
What's the most unconventional idea of a language you could think of? Let's just get speculative for a moment, right? Like, what's the wildest language you could possibly think of? Something that describes something.
Well,
What's the most unconventional way you could think of?
Braille.
Okay.
I've always thought that. For some reason.
That's kind of weird.
Yeah.
That's your weirdest?
It was weird.
I'd say what you mentioned the other day with smell.
Could you have a emotional language where, as long as we're both able to treat emotions, the experience of emotion, as a word or symbol in our minds and use that to communicate, say, through music?
That would have a huge assumption underlying it.
Yes. I mean, in a sense, you could have an emotion associated with that pencil.
That would have a huge assumption that we have similar or same emotions. That
How
we'd
do
be
you
able to
induce the
transmit.
sameness, though, so that people can converse over that?
But isn't that an assumption of every language?
Well, yes.
That there's some kind of shared experience, emotional or otherwise,
Yeah.
that we can then refer to.
I would say that I actually, if you think about what we're talking about languages here, right, as we're saying, there are these sort of associations, right? And synesthesia is an association. I actually think that what we take for as language, with our written language and our vocalized language or whatever, they are so sensory associations. You're associating a meaning or a sound with those shapes. There's nothing about this shape that means S, or chomps with an S, chomps. We're not sponsored, we want them to sponsor us. And then, 12 or pencil or whatever, right? There's nothing about those shapes that we're putting on this material in front of us that actually is equated to that. It's only sort of from the observer that we're doing that. And it just so happens that we all agree on that, and so we can converse using that, right? If I only knew Mandarin Chinese and you guys all knew French or English, good luck trying to communicate. It's going to be much harder, right? And so I think my sort of idea is that language is synesthesia, right? They're just associations, right? And if you think about it, it's really more about, what was potentially selected over time for sake of convenience, right? I think it's interesting that one of the more common ways that we think in terms of images and words and sounds in our head, right? Which also happens to be the way that we can more easily communicate across the human species.
But it's not universal.
Exactly. It's not universal.
Does language exist in a vacuum? Does the existence of a language imply that connection?
So what do you imagine in terms of the evolution of languages on the planet?
Mind reading.
Do you think we'll have mind-reading languages?
Yeah.
Do you think they exist now?
Oh, yeah.
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 What do they look like to you?
Mind reading?
Yeah.
Well, reading eyes, I'd call it universal as far as I think that it crosses over.
So this would extend to body
Different
language and
species.
things like that?
Eye language,
Eye language.
yeah.
Universal or universally learned, or universally learnable? Because for a lot of people,
Not
it's,
learnable for cats.
for a lot of humans though, it's not very easy to read eye language and you have to learn it actually explicitly. Sure, there's humans like that in the room besides me. It's a handful of us. So in that sense, it can't possibly be universally understood. And there must not be universally displayed versions of them. Otherwise, there wouldn't be people who can read some people who wouldn't be able to read others. Wouldn't there be?
Yeah, I think there are some people who aren't verbal, right? That's a thing. They can't necessarily participate in the same forms of language that other people do. There are people who speak different languages, right? And they can't participate they might not be able to participate in language X, but they certainly participate in language Y.
But then why can cats learn facial language, but some humans are unable to? Whereas cats seem to have a very difficult time learning, say, English or Russian or whatever language.
Like
Do they?
Prefrontal cortex, or not
A lot
having
more
it as
difficult than
developed.
facial language. Yes, but why then are some humans worse at that?
Maybe because we've evolved to pick up different patterns depending on what was more useful or not to survive.
When language first was introduced, the part of our brains, right, our cortex grew. So, and that's kind of what differentiates us evolutionarily.
I'm sorry, when was language first introduced?
When was it? I
Yes.
don't know when. I know that part of the cortex, or that's a theory, right? That part of our cortex, the parts that are associated with language, grew.
Can anyone point me to a time
Do we-
before language?
Yeah,
I
'cause
mean-
Do we consider mathematics a language?
Well, that brings up what I was
Before any language.
gonna mention.
Spoken language.
There's a
Like
age-old debate, particularly in mathematics, is it
Yeah.
invented or discovered?
Species
Yeah.
who uses languages.
And the unreasonable
No,
effectiveness
like-
of that discovery.
Maybe theoretic languages.
200,000 years ago,
Right, in terms of.
language was theorized to be
Yeah, I was gonna say
developed.
150.
Was it this first spoken language, or
Um,
written? Because wasn't ancient Sumerian the first written language?
No, it's simply the oldest one that we still have records of.
Okay.
Based on
And also it
languages.
happens what we
Okay.
interpret as a language. Maybe there were things before that that we wouldn't.
We don't
in our
recognize
current
them
con- Yeah.
Yeah, it's the oldest that we know
Yeah.
of.
So like the question with mathematics, are human languages invented or are they discovered? Are they inevitable natural objects that we kind of stumble upon?
Is that distinction meaningful?
And this is also sort of asking the idea, is there anything such as new? So in the creative process, people say, oh, you're just taking two different things that weren't combined before, and you experience that as something new.
But that's everything.
Exactly. In a sense, right?
But is there, what would you call something that develops through both causal intervention and the rest of the environment, right? You can say is a word invented, maybe, but can you say is the entire language invented? Like invented by whom? Doesn't
Right.
invent need a
You
date,
know-
time?
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah, that's the point.
So, if you have any, like, if you're using the block model of the universe where like the past and present like coexist and like what we consider now is just like essentially just like a slice of it, then technically everything in the future currently, or it kind of like exists, like all future languages and all past ones. So like, I figured I should, like would add that. Didn't you? Sorry.
No, it's an interesting thing, but to that extent, if everything exists, then everything is discovered.
And can you have other,
Isn't that true?
let's say, facets of a mind? Have any of you heard of Tulpamancy? So I believe that this is something about, you know, how we talk, there's a voice in your head or some other thing that's doing the talking or thinking, whatever. And, you know, some people will take this thing, even if they don't have it, and they'll train this to a degree where it's like an entirely different entity. It's almost like they have DID to a sense, but they're still communicating with it. And so people will spend thousands of hours, long periods of time training this, and they'll have different representations. There'll be, you know, a different gender or a different age or of a different culture, or they made up a brand new culture. It could be an alien, it could be a dream entity, it could be all these different things that people can create that we
So how would this be different from multiple personality syndrome?
Is it so different?
Is this like an internal monologue?
It's like if normally your internal monologue is a voice, this is like you're building it up to almost like there's an entire another person inside of you. Like with a range of personality and its own memories, it can think and talk in its own language in a sense, and it can have its own like facial features. And it doesn't have to actually be a face. It could be something you recognize as a face.
And this would be in the context of someone doing this purposefully to
So
themselves.
people will say they sometimes experience this in dreams or sleep-deprived states or under certain substances, but this is something you can train in a sober state. There's people that specifically practice for this.
Does anyone here write?
Right?
Yeah.
Right? Or right? Yes.
Like write, like fiction.
Every now and then.
In the past.
Have you experienced the feeling of when a character comes to you when you
Yes.
start talking to them?
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about?
You could say that's a form of tulpamancy. That's one of the ways people will train it. Right?
Oh, Tupala, now I know what you're
Yeah,
saying.
Tulpa.
Oh, okay, got
I
it.
think connects the two.
Yeah. And so it's interesting that, so it's considered pretty esoteric, right? This tulpamancy thing, right? But I actually think we all have some form of this, which is what we call the voice in our head or whatever. And the question is how much is the voice in our head representative of who we truly are?
Well, this is like, did you watch the Bruce Hood video, The Self-Illusion?
I haven't watched that yet.
It's a great clip. We'll link to it.
I'll link it, yeah.
And this neuroscientist, Bruce, he claims that our notion of self is really an illusion. And it's not that it's not real, but it's just not what we think it is. And the joke I put with it is that we are all figments of our own imagination. And I think what you're suggesting is instantiating multiple sort of software personalities or software selves purposefully.
Yeah.
This happens a lot with trauma, unfortunately.
Yeah.
People in very difficult emotional situations will create another figment, let's say, that can then help balance those very powerful emotions.
Yeah.
It'd be like different sorts of like not different people necessarily, but like within your internal monologue, there's like a different kind of like perspective that you're talking to.
It's
Not necessarily perspective,
it
but
can
different
sometimes
kind of
range that
voice.
you're talking to an entirely different person. And what's interesting is people have said that they've almost taken on their own life. Like you can talk to them, they'll go walk away somewhere else, come back later in the day, and they had a whole set of experiences. And it's like you're not consciously thinking of that. You're not actively thinking of that, at least to your perception. And yet this is happening.
Does anyone here not have one in your monologue?
That was going to be my next question, because some people don't.
I know, some people don't. Everyone has one?
I mean, not really.
An inner monologue doesn't necessarily have to be voice, by the way.
Although if anyone doesn't have voice, that's interesting too.
Yeah.
I think in images.
Yeah.
Your inner monologue is not verbal?
Yeah, I guess.
No, I think in images.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Do tell.
Well, whenever I think of the past, I think of like an array of images. Or like when I think of a concept, I think of like when I saw it on a page.
Okay, well that doesn't count. But do you have an inner monologue?
No, it's not voice, it's image.
You have no voice in your head.
Unless I talk to myself, like forcibly, like to simulate an inner
We
monologue.
found one.
It doesn't really come naturally now.
But can you
Level
read without speaking? You read quietly.
Like, is there a voice in your head when you read a page that's kind of like your voice?
If there's no voice, are you good at speed reading? Because apparently some speed readers are generally better at it because they don't have
I
voice.
have to use my finger.
Okay,
I really could do that well.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could read without the monologue?
Without the monologue, super fast. Also typing, but I don't think that's correlated.
I read without the monologue as well when I speed read. Although when I read literature, like just for fun, I usually do it with the monologue for fun.
What about phantasia, like internal sensory experience? And so the classic example is you close your eyes and you think of an apple. And now what did you experience?
Or the chomps. You can imagine the chomps inside of your head, right?
Right.
Or a David bar, right? You can imagine that.
That's kind of a synesthesia I have. I can eat things and imagine that sensory experience without actually doing so.
It could be good for
Or
cooking.
is that just a memory? Or is
Essentially,
You
it
can
is.
manipulate it.
Yeah, but like I could imagine like taking a bite of chomps with a bite of lemon wedge, and I've never done that before,
it? Okay.
but it kind of makes sense,
So if someone had that for smell, for instance, they could infer and you smell,
right?
right? But we'll get into that in a bit. But the thing that I want to finish up on is, as well for a bit is also, you've probably all heard of method actors. They're generally quite well liked in filmmaking, right? And I think part of the interesting thing there... Huh? Say what?
Method actors are well liked in film.
Well liked for their ability to take on the character.
Their performances are
Maybe not while they're filming.
Yeah.
Maybe not while they're filming. Probably especially not while they're filming, but afterwards if they recover.
Sorry if I've offended any method actors.
Yes, we love method actors. We want them on the podcast. Anyways, so the thing that's interesting, right, is it is almost this type of tulpa that you're building up in your head. Right, and you're embodying that tulpa. You're building up an entirely different character with its own, people think, okay, in a sense, it is an actor's job to lie for a living. Like, that's kind of what it is, but you're not it's not the same as if you, yourself right now, are lying per se, although maybe some do, right? The idea is that you're taking on an entirely different character. You're really getting in their shoes. You're thinking the way they think, speaking the way they would. Very good interviewers also do this, right? And I think that's also technically a form of a tulpa. Right? And it's just you're more directly embodying and interacting with that. Right? What I'd be really curious to see is what happens to the personas and the characters that method actors have built up in their head when they're done with the role.
Yeah, I don't think they go away. This
Yeah.
is something that almost frightened me as a kid with acting, right? At least that's the closest word, because I felt that way. I felt like to really engage as a character, you're not faking it. You're becoming that other person. And your unconscious isn't going to know the difference. And so I always thought there was this kind of playing with fire aspect to really engaging in a role like that.
Do you feel it's almost a state of self-hypnosis?
Yeah, 100%. But now, this would be interesting to try to apprentice. This gets back to the synesthesia and learning different languages. If people could safely and reliably instantiate multiple personalities in your mind, would that have utility? Would you do that, right? You could have your work personality that is really studious and types really fast and pays attention to all the notes and all this other kind of stuff. And then when the bell rings, that turns off. You sort of snap out of it like a coma, and then you go back to your recreational self, whatever that might be. And then on Monday morning, you can just punch back into that other personality.
Is that not something that everyone does?
Makes sense.
To some approximation, we do that. We do that, right? That's what it means to go to work.
Different people speaking different languages.
Yeah.
I've always been a firm believer in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you
say again?
That we're a different person when we speak different languages.
Sort of superior worth.
I think it depends on the person, but for me, it has always invoked different emotions with me, depending on the language that I'm speaking.
So who speaks multiple languages?
The same. I think almost all of us.
everybody.
I guess I can.
So does everybody agree? Are you a different person when you speak a different language?
Do you feel a different way?
I think when I speak Portuguese specifically, it's a different culture, different sets of emotion, different strengths of the emotion. I think my personality becomes a lot more outgoing when I speak Portuguese.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel I switch languages when I feel certain things or
Yes,
am thinking in certain ways, but I wouldn't say that makes me a different person.
Yeah, maybe not a different person.
There's a weird discontinuity, which is weird because sometimes it's your mind changes. And how many of you guys randomly switch languages sometimes in speech? You do? I do.
Sometimes.
You never did?
Me, only if I have to, but not
You
to
don't just
the
naturally
way that
switch?
you do. I know what you mean.
How about music as the language, right? How do you express yourself differently through that?
Yeah,
Or if mathematics is the language, how do you
I-
express yourself mathematically?
Well, I think that, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, that in sheet music, there are certain terms throughout the music composition that guides you in how to play the instrument. You know, whether it's loud, soft, quick, slow, romantic per se.
Yeah.
You know, so I think there's a correlation of somewhat in that sense as well.
But even not written language, like one of the things that makes me most interested when I see handwritten scores, like something that's sent to an arranger. So I don't know if you guys know, you can go to the Library of Congress and down in their music room, they can pull like just about every score that was submitted for copyright. So you can get like film scores, and they're weird, low resolution, handwritten glyphs of something. And I found this one score, and it was strange because there were just places in the score where it was just like, Doug, you know what to do. And Doug was the arranger in this piece. And there's just like random things where there's just like a note head with a stem and no notes on it. Or there's a couple of well-placed squiggles. And the crazy thing is I intuitively knew what that sounded like.
Do you think it was just massive compression, like shorthand?
It's massive compression, but it has to have some linguistic element, because you can know almost exactly what that's supposed to sound like, and an arranger can go and take this sheet that is heavily compressed and get the sound that the composer wants. And none of that was expressed explicitly, so it has to be somehow a linguistic element, not in words.
Now, do you think, because this is something I was thinking about just the other day, is music purely intellectual, or is there something grounded about your ears and that response? In other words, imagine you're stuck in solitary confinement or whatever it is, but you have a stack of sheet music, right? Can you just jam out to sheet music? Like,
Well, I have heard
could
they
that be
use-
your jukebox all day long?
I have heard that they use music to torture people in confinement.
Well, that's a separate, they play Baby Shark in the parks now to prevent people from sleeping in them. No, this would...
Are you serious?
Yeah. No, this would be like, is there with enough training or exposure, could you get the same kind of rich experience just reading sheet music? Or is there something wired about our ears and so on that makes the music interesting?
You mean without having played?
Yeah, no play, just like piano rolls, scores,
Without
sheet music.
having
Yeah,
played.
because I mean,
in the
look at
past
like
when you weren't.
the synth
Yeah, theoretically,
patterns.
like I've never, let's just assume you've never even heard music.
Oh.
Right, it
Could you appreciate, like, is it in the sheet music?
No.
Because I can
still-
experience it in
so.
the sheet
I
music.
think maybe if you've heard the song before
Yeah.
and you already have that experience with it, and then
Yeah.
you read the sheet music, maybe it would elicit the same response. But if somebody had never heard music,
No, I mean like just fresh
Oh.
sheet music and you look at it and you're like, you start moving.
Is there
I think if you learned how to mount between them properly, because this is how like a lot of prosthetics work, like
Yeah.
what's it called, brain port, the thing that goes on your tongue and people use it to be able to see and stuff. And it's because if you can do two things at the same time, your brain learns to mount one thing to another. I don't know if you could do it by like, if you were deaf and you only ever read
Right.
music though. I don't know about that one. But I think if you read enough music while listening to enough music for like a year straight, you could maybe just
you
sort
can
of
ask
read
yourself,
it and get it.
what's the
As a
music
musician,
analog
I
for
can.
deaf people?
Like as a musician
Yeah.
though, back to what you were saying, I can see a score of something I've never seen before.
But are you playing it in your head?
I can hear it in my head, but I don't have to.
You can appreciate the
You can
musical
hear it, like you
structure.
can hear that. Like in like a hyper fantasia type thing, like you can actually hear that.
I can,
Okay.
but I don't have to.
Got it.
Because I can like read through the music and actually appreciate the musical ideas without having to process it.
Which is sort of like saying, do you have to read? You know, we already do that in a sense when we have words and letters on a piece of paper when we have that voice in your head saying it, right? It's also very similar.
is art a language,
Yes.
A language?
or can it be a language?
The
If it's
the article
communication.
there, I feel like is kind of important.
That's just a language. No? All right, let's see. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
I think to have a language, you have to have a set of symbols, even if you can sort of keep expanding this set of symbols as much as you want. Kind of like what you were talking about. So they've expanded the set of symbols in these film scores. But I think you have to have some sort of like discrete set of symbols.
Symbols don't necessarily have to be discrete themselves. They just have to have discrete elements.
Yes, this is true. So I think some arts are probably, some types of art or language, like Renaissance art is all about symbols. It's like, here's this piece of artwork and there's 200 symbols in it. And if you can piece together the symbols, you can unpack what this piece of artwork is about. But other types of artwork that aren't based on sort of throwing 200 symbols into a piece of artwork and making it really busy like that, I don't know.
But symbols can be like layered. Like take languages that use cursive scripts. So Arabic, the Perso-Arabic scripts, various other scripts of different languages, where there is a huge fluidity of the actual written text, but there are features that are discrete. But there can be other semantic information in actually how the text is drawn on the page. And even in languages with discrete, right, symbols, like say the Latin alphabet in English, we use other typographical features to impose, or superimpose actually, some form of semantics, such as italics, boldface, underline.
And it would seem all spoken languages are like that. We're embedding digital discrete symbols inside of a larger analog kind of phrase, and that can have emotion and emphasis and things.
But the phrase can also be broken down into symbols in some cases, right? Like italic is a symbol.
Faces are symbols.
Right, it's a discrete element, if you will. No? You disagree?
Yeah, I think you just have to have some kind of discrete symbol. So I think I enjoy a lot of modern art. I'm a weirdo like that.
I think.
You mean Jackson Pollock, or you mean other one?
He means like the banana on the wall.
Yeah, I enjoy that. I also enjoy Jackson
Yeah.
Pollock, but Jackson Pollock's a great example because his work has like a vibe kind of, and you get something from it, but it doesn't have symbols in it really. I don't think. If you can see them, I'm impressed. I don't see any kind of symbols in that are interpretable in the way that you would see in like a Renaissance painting or something.
Can a pixel be a symbol in and of itself? And the collection of pixels as a collection of symbols, if you go low enough.
In a QR code.
No.
I mean, you could represent a like set of binary data with a pixel with a large enough color depth, and you could use that to represent a concept, I suppose. Other than that, not really.
Wait, do symbols have to convey meaning? I mean, I think for a language to be good, if you will, every symbol has to convey meaning.
We could try to invent the worst language, I guess, but.
Well, think of how we visually represent faces on actual analog film or digitally on a screen, right? Where that's a representation of a face of something that's happening in front of you and it's displayed on there, right? And then if you abstract away more details, you get something that looks like a cartoon. You abstract and distort more information, you get something that looks like a Picasso. And if you go really far, you'll get something that looks like a Jackson Pollock, right? Are they all, it sort of depends on the context and the understanding of the observer. Disagree?
I think it's actually based on what the important parts are of whatever the symbol is. So the symbol of a face has you have sort of eyes and a nose or whatever else. And,
So are we referring to glyphs?
In a sense.
Or are we referring to symbols abstractly?
I'm referring to symbols abstractly as sort of like a thing you recognize that means a thing. So if I see a face, no matter where it is, if it's a cartoon or if it's on a person, I'm going to be like, that's a human face.
But face is the symbol or the glyph of a face, whatever it is?
Wait, it's a thing you understand that means a thing. There's things that you don't understand yet that will eventually mean a thing when you learn them.
Yes, this is true.
Yeah.
But I think with faces and talking about Picasso and everything, you're not getting rid of the symbol, you're just abstracting the symbol to sort of the most minimalist interpretation. You're compressing it as much as you can. Picasso he just has a couple of eyes and a nose. And he's impressive because he's managed to compress a face into just the elements that we absolutely need to recognize a face. But I don't think you're getting away from discrete symbols there.
It reminds me of this idea of symbols that have some kind of mapping directly to what they're referring to, and then other symbols are just completely unrelated. So like if we draw a face, there's some mapping between that and an actual face. But if I write the letters FACE, they're just random. They're kind of arbitrary. They don't actually correspond to a face at all. And what I think is interesting about animal communication is there's kind of more of a direct mapping between the emotional state and the actual symbol. And so the example I like is a lion can't fake its roar. If it roars, it's angry. It doesn't have any way of like making that noise when it's not in that emotional state. But humans with language, I can just say like roar, not actually mean it, right, in a sense, right? You can have a roar that's not a roar. And I think that's what's interesting about like digital versus more analog language.
Does anyone know how to pronounce the word SEMEMES? Sorry.
Siamese?
No. Like sememes?
SEMEMES?
Like semaphore?
No, like units of meaning.
Yeah, same as semaphore.
Sememes, sememes,
Samemes, I would think.
sememes?
Yeah, like semantic meme.
Yeah,
Yeah, Samemes.
yeah. Sememes or whatever they are. Is that what we're talking about though with discrete symbols, or are we talking about symbols in how we actually encode them?
So this is a good flag, because we might be talking past each other here. When I'm talking about discrete symbols, and I can't speak for anyone else here, I mean, you have one thing that either represents something in the real world or a set of things in the real world, or it represents a set of symbols. But sort of at the bottom of the dependency chart, you have something in the real world. And so a symbol can represent two symbols that represent three symbols that all represent things in the real world. But somewhere at the bottom of that dependency chart, there's something in the real world, when I'm thinking of it.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean something in the real world? So what about functional features like, say, a period?
I think that's just syntactic sugar. It's there.
Yeah, but
it's
that's
there
still
so
a
we're able to
symbol.
Yeah, but it's there so that's to help with compression.
It's not a sememe.
You can also change the meaning of a sentence. Let's go eat kids, or let's go eat, comma, kids. You can actually change the meaning.
It's true.
Dramatically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, hey, like $5 million was lost over a comma in, what was it, Maine? I forgot what the state is with that lawsuit.
When I'm thinking of symbols, I am separating that from syntax, which is what I would consider periods or what I would consider in a coding language extra stuff. Symbols, I mean, are something that at some point gets back to something that you can sense.
So like a word is a symbol?
A word is a symbol.
Okay, so you're talking about sememes, sememes, whatever.
Yeah, maybe I need to use a different word. I'm talking about some memes.
Okay.
So that would be like in the Chinese language, if you have the symbol of the tree, or it's evolved over the years to mean many other things, but the basic foundation is based on a tree.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a meme can refer to many things. That's okay. It can refer to lots of things in the real world, and you kind of have to infer based on the context. Or maybe people keep it fuzzy on purpose. People do this in poetry all of the time.
Go ahead.
It's interesting actually to see how poetry is very different in different languages.
Yeah.
Like for instance, the Russian language supports a far more flexible syntax, and so you don't have the same awkwardness that you do when you read English poetry.
What do you mean by flexible in this case?
I mean, word order is not fixed, and it really would not sound awkward if you switched up word order in a sentence.
Yeah, like he ate or ate he.
Yeah, and like you would say that in speech and it wouldn't be weird at all.
Yeah.
So when you use, right, it does carry semantic meaning. Semantic meaning. Redundancy much. But it's not, it doesn't feel contrived. And so you don't have that same, hey, this is weird, which can also be a bit of a drawback, right? Because that, hey, this is weird in English poetry causes you to stop and, I don't know, kind of interrupts you in your mind, at least in my experience.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot uses this a lot. He'll even have like a single word, and then he'll have 3 lines before the next line intentionally to make you stop and process what you just read and then collect yourself and move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
But anyone have that experience with like poetry in different languages? Latin's also similar, you don't have as much awkwardness.
What is language missing? If we were to improve language over the next decade or next 100 years, what is it that's difficult to do in human language that we would want?
Constrained by the brain and what it can process, so you can't execute programming language in your brain, so that's constraint.
I mean, I'm not convinced you can't run programs in your head.
Because people used to write down programs for quite a while. You know.
I think we will eventually learn more about how like we actually go and think, and we will be able to construct languages which allow us to think in more efficient manner.
I'm actually doubtful of this unless you're talking about sort of we ascend into a computer, because there's an effect that I can't remember the name of it, but essentially languages have like bits of information per word. Different languages have different bits of information per word. And in general, from what I understand from this effect they studied, and it's only a few handful of languages, so maybe it doesn't extend, but at least in the handful of languages they studied, people speak the languages at different speeds, but the bits of information are pretty constant. And so Spanish speakers will speak a lot more quickly than English speakers, or even people who know both languages, they'll speak more quickly when they're speaking Spanish, and that's because on average Spanish has less bits of information per word. And so I'm doubtful that I think maybe we could get a language where you can represent a lot of bits of information per word, but at that point you might be saying like one word a minute or something.
So it would take a lot slower to process it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't know if that gets around, and unless you're talking about like brain expansion and plugging a chip in or something like that, I don't know if that gets around the core issue.
So there's a very similar phenomenon with syntactical features. So for instance, your commas, periods, word order, insert endings, whatever, prefixes, suffixes, infixes, which are interesting in some languages. They exist in English, right? People always forget that we have infixes in English. They're just used as they're just used for emphasis, expletives usually. You'll always sort of see it's a trade-off because we have to convey the same types of information in syntax, and we also have to convey it at effectively the same rate, right? Overall. So you'll find that not just the number of features available, but the frequency that is used of those features seems to be relatively constant across different languages when you average them out.
Do you think that there are no free lunches in language design in the same way there are no free lunches in like sort of optimal algorithms, and that you have to have a trade-off?
Well, the evidence seems to show it, and logic would indicate it as well.
Was the question like improvements on language that we don't have now? Because, I mean, we don't have a way to describe things that are innately human, really. Like,
Do you have examples?
In what language?
pain. You would describe it as sharp, as dull. What does that mean? That's how you describe a knife.
Yeah.
If I could say, like, I guess the fundamental thing that a language is trying to solve is taking whatever idea I have and putting it in someone else's brain. So, like, my configuration of neurons going into someone else's configuration of neurons. So wouldn't the most efficient possible language simply be a direct mapping, neurons to neurons?
Mind reading.
No, it wouldn't be the most
Mind
efficient.
communicating. You have to read and then you rewrite. Mind rewriting.
It wouldn't be the most efficient. It would be the most complete, but we really don't need that complete picture, right? We want something that's as compressed as possible for the things we care about.
Well, how would you compress it further?
How would you compress further than every single bit? If you think about it, every bit is like as uncompressed as it gets.
Well, it's in the brain, it's not bits, it's neurons.
Bits of information, right? You're conveying the entire piece of information. Whereas it'd be just fine to have a much smaller amount of information that just delivers just enough functional understanding. And to the best of my knowledge, our neurons do not have a structure that would allow that.
So maybe language serves as a communication medium and a compression algorithm, so I don't have to get all of the bits of my brain into brain. And maybe the structure of the language sort of compresses it for me, so I don't have to do a lot. I just use my vernix area, and that knows the language, and that allows me to compress it and then get it over to it.
That's how you pronounce that name? I'm sorry.
Wernicke?
Oh, it's right.
Wernicke.
Wernicke?
Wernicke.
Wernicke?
Yeah.
That's right.
And Wernicke.
So how do you create a language that avoids misunderstandings?
You don't.
Can you? Yeah.
That wouldn't be a very useful language, would it?
Because the other funny thing to think about, right, is like I could literally have, a sentence or paragraph or whatever, and in that thing, you could be reading the same sounds and symbols or whatever, right? But the actual meaning, you could take away something different, right? So things have this ambiguity to the information where there's multiple ways of seeing it, right? And that's almost the beauty of like poetry or song lyrics, right? Where they can be interpreted multiple different ways, right?
It's not a bug, it's a feature, right?
Yeah.
Oh, can I ask, okay, so if I want to talk to somebody about like differential geometry, I can use the term like differential geometry, and they if they know that term, they can will know what I mean, and therefore by adding extra terms, which don't take much time to say, actually, you can convey a lot of meaning in a very small amount of bits, and if you were to have to describe it word for word what it is. And you could potentially, our language has words like is, the, we, there, going, or whatever. And it's possible that there might be other sets of words like that, which we could use, which might be more efficient somehow in some way. I don't know. Just an idea.
A lot of languages don't even have articles like the, and we just
Yeah. I don't understand the point of those articles.
like Russian.
Yeah, Russian has no articles. I see no reason for them.
And how strong of a modifier is language of perception?
Almost all of us are multilingual.
Well, what about for example, those sites where they don't have words for numbers greater than 5,
Yeah.
and objectively in tests they can't do math that's over the number 5.
You can, it just becomes more difficult.
There's also a few languages that are that don't have recursion. So, a thing always represents a thing in the world. You can't come up with a symbol that represents symbols that represent a thing in the world. Just everything represents one thing in the world, and there's only been a couple of those that have been found by.
Doesn't that just make communication take a lot longer?
I imagine it doesn't if all you're talking about is things in the real world. If your life is hunting and gathering, which is where these languages come from, then it's probably pretty useful to have a language that doesn't have a bunch of extra features. It's just all right, there's a thing I'm going to go kill.
But for things like rules and policies and philosophies, it's hard not to have
Recursion.
Actually, that's kind of interesting. Because if you had a language in which it would be much harder to discuss more complicated topics, right? Language tends to reflect the things we need to convey the most. If you make your language in such a way that it's harder to convey things that you don't want conveyed, or say you want to be simple hunter-gatherers, would it be advantageous in some way?
These languages were a whole controversial thing in the field of linguistics, because the view before that was you have to have recursion in your language, and if you don't, it doesn't count. And
You don't have to.
when the guy discovered this tribe that speaks this certain language, the first one that got discovered, he got attacked, and people were trying to discredit him and everything else.
Can they talk about blue things, or only particular things that happen to be blue?
From what I understand, that they can only talk about particular things that happen to be blue. They can only talk about things in the real world.
Right.
The guy was started as a missionary and then lost his faith and became a linguist, which is an interesting story on its own. But he really struggled to talk to them as a missionary, because he would be he would talk about this guy Jesus, and they would be where is he? Is he with you? When is he going to visit? And he would, and the Bible's a very symbolic book, and I think all religions are very
So
symbolic.
then they can't really have dramas or comedies or...
Do you think language is a simulation? And can be used to simulate things?
I think we can use it to simulate
Yeah.
things, right?
Do you think language is inherently tied to religion and vice versa?
Yes.
Or vice versa?
In its creation or over time?
Inherently. In its existence. If you think about it, the Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father, whatever, that is the most translated text. It is translated into almost every known language, and it's effectively the Rosetta Stone when you think about linguistics, right? But
It's in Solar Soul.
if you think about a lot of languages, right? The only record we have of them, the only reason we know about them is because they're used in some religious text of some religion somewhere. Is there something inherently tied between religion and language where a religion requires a language to exist? Or vice versa, between language and religion, where a language requires
How do we
a
describe religion? What do we describe? In a more abstract sense, right? Beyond just the ones that we currently have.
Easy.
How did I write to you?
I think the classical definition of religion would be, there's a few different definitions. The one that I go by is some set of ontological beliefs about the world, so things that you believe are true in some sense, that don't necessarily have a direct correspondence to measurable physical reality. And so I think I have a very wide definition of religion, though. A lot of people would disagree with that because a lot of people have ontological beliefs about the world that don't correspond to measurable physical reality and wouldn't consider that religion.
Well, it seems to me it's kind of the opposite of the language you were just discussing. Rather than only focusing on real things, it's language precisely about things that aren't obviously in the world.
Yeah. I think that's a good explanation.
And why is it that we can discuss and talk about things that are non-physical or things we don't consider to be real?
I think we can make comparisons between them and things we know. Who was it that talked about pain being sharp? That was you. I think that was a great observation. So we can talk about pain as its own thing because at the bottom of the dependency chart is something in the real world, which is sort of a sharp thing. And I think we can do this arbitrarily, so we can do the same thing with religion. So I could say, I'm Christian. I could say I have a relationship with Jesus, which is comparable to a relationship I would have with a human who is a very close friend of mine. And everybody knows what it's like to have a close friend, I hope. And so they can say, oh, okay, so I know about this thing that's in the real world, and so I can imagine sort of the thing that he's talking about.
Would religious figures be represented as tulpas inside your mind?
I would argue they are.
Yeah.
Not for
Religious
me.
figures?
Huh?
Religious figures?
Yeah,
So
if
does
you-
everyone have like an image that they come up with for like what they think
In a sense.
God would be?
Depending how strong. I mean,
Isn't that not like
you have to also think about this for a minute, though.
necessarily?
Slight-
Just put it in concept.
Slight sidetrack, right? But think about this for a moment, right? Is that, think of how much more, I don't know if economic or efficient is the right word, but okay, you believe you're being watched. And you don't have, someone doesn't have to spend the time and money and energy to do that. And yet society or, an organization or collective is still acting as if it's that, right? That is a more efficient way of doing things, right? And it's interesting because it's like, do things need to actually be kept track of to be held accountable, or do they need to believe they're being kept track of to be accountable?
On an individual or group scale? Individual or group scale?
Both.
We have two different phenomena.
Individual
Individual
and
scale,
group.
yes, they do.
And how
Group
that relates
scale,
to the
no, they
tulpa.
don't.
Yeah. Well, is the tulpa almost like an accountability mechanism for people who believe a certain way about? I mean, and I say religion. It could even be a religion that you create, a culture that you create, a culture that values certain things that we normally attribute with some type of existing religion, right? Are those things that are built up in your head? People that will say, a God speaks to them, or this entity or this thing speaks to them. So many people throughout history have said their ideas came to them. They heard it in a dream. They heard it as a voice. Something else brought it to them, right? How do we represent what that is, right? Because that does look and sound a little bit like a tulpa.
I think it's interesting you brought up dreams because I was thinking about that a few minutes ago. Does anybody have a dream that they kind of vaguely remember in the past few months, right? Did it have other characters in it? No.
Really?
No.
Did anybody have a dream that had other characters and maybe some dialogue?
Sure.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you were generating the other characters' dialogue?
I've read about that. The only thing I'm familiar with is that I've read articles where they say that every character actually represents another aspect of you.
Right.
But I don't sense that in the dream.
But do
be
you,
the case.
in other words, like when something happens in the dream, right? Does it feel surprising?
No, not for me ever.
For you, it's never surprising.
No, I always feel like I'm generating it. I've been a lucid dreamer for a long time.
But even if there's like dialogue in the other character,
Yeah.
you're puppeting the other character.
Yeah, and I feel like that.
Consciously?
Sorry. Do you have a different experience?
Speak a little
No,
bit.
I never felt that way before.
I almost always feel that way in my dreams.
I feel that way right before, like so I've had some dreams where I don't see another person, there's no one else, and then I've had them where I'm just alone, but the ones where I do have someone else, I always feel like that I feel like I wake up like shortly after that.
Who here's a lucid dreamer?
It used to be.
You used to be? Or can lucid dream sometimes, or knows when they're dreaming.
I know when I'm dreaming.
Okay. So we've got
You know,
spectrum.
I used to be able to smell in my dreams too.
Hmm?
I could smell smells in my dream.
Did you lose the ability to smell?
Yeah,
Okay. Sorry, didn't.
well, it doesn't matter, I mean, it's, well. But,
I've definitely
But-
eaten things in my dreams.
has anybody, are you yourself in your dream or are you somebody else? Have you experienced, the perspective that you're in a dream, you're another person entirely?
No.
Either a real or fictional person or something that's synesthetic like a shape or color or sound?
Yeah, but
Someone else, yeah.
are there other people in the dream? And if so, who's puppeteering
Yeah.
those characters? Who's writing their dialogue, essentially?
I've had dreams where like I'm talking to someone who doesn't speak English in real life, but they're speaking English to me in the dream.
Yeah.
So would that not be a form like me imposing on them what they do?
I wonder, what language do people speak in all of your dreams?
There was one dream where I spoke Japanese, and I'm not fluent in it at all.
Do you know if it was correct Japanese?
It sounded like it.
Sounded like
But maybe it just triggered that sounds like Japanese neurons.
Maybe.
Varies. Depending on what I'm dreaming about, either English or Russian, sometimes another language. Yeah.
Usually everybody's speaking English, but I also have a lot of agency in my dreams, so that could have something to do with it.
Do you ever have people speaking in a language that you don't understand?
Yeah.
At all?
Yeah.
In your dream?
Yeah.
I have it sometimes, but it's very rare. Huh, interesting.
Well, how does this also relate to the things that we attribute agency to in, say, hallucinations or after taking psychoactive compounds? Or we attribute, people will say there are these entities or things that people are experiencing and interacting with, and they'll say, "Man, this is pretty damn real," right? I also would say there is some connection between that and the Tulpamancy thing, because you would say this is technically to some degree inside your mind, right? Whatever mind is. And, people have worked up the ability they'll say they can understand it. They have a revelation, but as soon as they're no longer in that state, they're like, the letter W, what did that mean? That was the biggest insight I had in my
It was
life.
also clear at the time.
Yeah. Which is, actually, there is this thing people talk about in psychedelics about false revelations and stuff like that, right? We're in that state, in that context, that feels like, man, you hit something. This is giant. You've changed, this is it. You're going to come out, you're going to change the world, and then you're out of here like, what does this scribbling thing mean? I thought this was it.
Are they false?
Huh?
Are they false if they're consistent?
I don't know.
Across people?
Across, yeah.
This is something I was going to bring up, actually, because I work for the National Institute of Drug Abuse Monitoring, online, people that talk about drugs online, basically.
Heroin.
Yeah, actually. And so for my job, I read hundreds of comments from people
That's
every
fun.
week, and there's a lot of things that are consistent between at least people taking the same drug, even if they hadn't heard of the thing before. So like, maybe you've heard of machine L's with psilocybin, but there's other ones with other drugs, so people will intentionally take really large amounts of ibuprofen.
Yep.
Which you shouldn't do. It will give
Don't
you,
do it.
It will give you Alzheimer's at like 40. Don't do it. But people do it. They'll take like 2 bottles of ibuprofen or whatever, and they'll see like this entity they call the Hat Man.
Oh,
And
isn't
stuff
that
like
with
that.
Benadryl too? I've heard
Yeah.
a lot with
You've done it.
Benadryl.
Don't do that either. None of
No,
these
no,
things
no.
are made to take at that scale.
Don't do it.
I'm serious. I'll tell you. I will tell you that other drugs are fine to do. Don't do those.
Yeah.
I read about people who have just are in a nursing home at 35 or 40 or something.
Yeah.
So this.
I know someone who did DMT, and they said that they experienced themselves in a different lifetime. Like 40 years, they lived in a different lifetime. They had kids with somebody.
Sounds like salvia.
Yeah, they raised their kids, and then they woke up out of the trip, and they faced a very deep depression because they felt like they lost their family.
Now, how's all that shit happening in here?
I don't know.
And to go back on to the figures that the DMT helps, what about sleep paralysis? A lot of people say, they see the tall, dark man on the corner of their bed looking at them, but that's not induced by psychoactive drugs. That's just from sleeping.
I have sleep paralysis, but never experienced that.
Really?
I experience sleep paralysis during the day sometimes.
Because it's a pretty reoccurring thing about someone seeing the tall shadow man.
It's awful.
I've seen him once.
You've seen him once?
Yeah.
Talking about sleep paralysis.
I am.
No.
Has anybody had recurring dreams? Like the same dream over and over?
Induced or not?
Not induced.
Not induced.
Yes.
And I've had both.
No.
Does it stay the same, or does the ending change for you?
Doesn't change.
I had the same dream for 3 years of my life when I was a child, every single night.
Oh.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's how I learned to lucid dream.
When did it stop?
It just decreased in frequency, and then I haven't had it in years and years. But and then the dream wasn't anything super meaningful, but it was the same exact dream every single night for a few years. My mom told my doctor about it. She was concerned about it. Doctor was like, that's fine.
Did you recognize it? Was this before or after you started lucid dreaming?
I always recognized that it was a dream, and it was the same dream and everything.
I'm generally completely aware during my dreams, in my sleep. Like I was saying earlier, the transition from me being awake to sleep is my attention moving to something else. So there's not a sharp transition. And so when I was younger, I had a lot of trouble, am I awake? Is this a dream? It was kind of hard, right? And eventually you start to pick up, okay, this is a dream, this is whatever. But when I have tried substances in the past, don't do drugs, kids. When I have tried things in the past, there's a very, it just feels like something that's naturally coming on. There's a very smooth transition. Trust me, I'll know when you take a psychedelic and the time loop or something starts. Okay, that's happening. But it's like I'm watching it on a screen rather than I'm experiencing it.
Is that for every psychedelic you've tried?
Everything I've tried so far, I have this response to everything that I've tried. Now, don't get me wrong. I can still get one-shotted to a degree if I were to take enough, right? But it's the way I would describe it in my case is there's 1 foot in, 1 foot out every time. Through sleeping and dreaming, taking substances, it's I'm there. It's okay, I can get really, if it's a really good movie or a song or whatever, I get very invested in that. I can totally get zoned into that. But I'm still aware and feel the fact that I'm watching that. That's how it is with sleeping and dreaming. I'm very aware when I go into paralysis for sleep.
Okay.
Yeah. It's I'm watching something. 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Do you think it would be that way I don't know if you've tried but there are certain psychedelics where the experience, so I've heard, is very DMT, for example.
Yeah, I haven't tried,
Yeah, it's very, you do not know where,
That's possible.
Yeah.
It's very possible.
You don't know that you're tripping on DMT?
You don't have any awareness of time. You don't not necessarily, you're just in it.
No, I had...
Terrifying.
Not mine.
You're completely ripped from reality with that one. And I think with other ones that I've heard of, I think salvia, I've heard that,
Has anybody ever taken something, thought they took something, they thought they felt the effects of it, but they never actually took the thing? All right. You let's say you're smoking something, you're doing whatever, and you're all right, this is it. You can start to feel the effects, but then you realize, oh wait, the thing wasn't on, or nothing actually came out.
Placebo effect?
Yeah. And yet you can still feel something.
Until I learned to recognize it, I had the reverse placebo effect for a long time.
Interesting.
Where I was never convinced.
Yeah.
I was on anything, and then I saw a video of myself one video of myself really drunk and one video of myself really high. One time I was like, oh my gosh, that's a completely different experience than what I had going on inside my head. I thought I was like, this isn't affecting me or anything. And then I clearly from the video, something was affecting me.
I always try to record everything to make sure to see what the actual effect is.
Yeah,
So I experienced that too.
I had a reverse placebo effect for a long, long time. I was one of those really annoying drunk guys. I was like, I'm not.
Can you self-induce it?
Huh?
Can you self-induce the effect?
I still don't. I don't enjoy drinking or getting high because I still don't like feel anything internally. I just clearly have something going on.
Your baseline just the dabs?
Yeah. I still feel like I'm just sitting here talking to y'all just like I am now. And so there's not like a buzz or anything that's really enjoyable.
You've got that endogenous buzz.
Yeah, I have that same feeling.
I like the taste of beer and stuff, but like I just don't enjoy it a lot. I don't have.
Would you have this pink Moscato right here?
That's an interesting theory of mine that reminds me of somewhere. I think it was online, some kind of feed, and the person did not believe that there were people who actually enjoyed the taste of beer. They thought that they were just confabulating that and saying that because they liked the experience. And it was like an interesting theory of mine. They couldn't wrap their head around that some people would actually like beer.
Yeah, I actually like beer and whiskey from my first time tasting them, from what I understand is very rare. I blame it on growing up with Malta, but
with what?
It's like
a malt beverage.
Oh, Malta.
Yeah, Malta. It's like a bitter Cuban drink. My grandma always had it at her house, and people say it tastes kind of like beer. And so
There's also this soda called Malta, I think.
That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I thought. Wait, were you talking about a soda?
It's like halfway to a soda. It's got some kind of carbonation, but not as much as like a Coca-Cola.
Oh,
it's kind of like Foss, right?
Kind of. I haven't tried that actually, so I wouldn't know. But at any rate, my experience with alcohol is very uncharacteristic. I have never enjoyed the buzz and always enjoyed the taste of it.
I don't know. I'm the same way, so I don't know if that's uncharacteristic. Anyone else the same way?
They like the taste?
Yes, and not particularly the buzz.
I mean, I just don't see the appeal of alcohol.
It's good.
Beer is good.
But
I'm a wine guy.
It reminds me
And whiskey.
of earlier we were talking about with language, and would the idea be to expand language until it's sufficient to do something interesting, or is it always going to be better to have multiple languages? In some weird Gödel kind of paradox that any one language will have this kind of Swiss cheese effect where it can't talk about itself, and so it's going to always be better to have some other completely different language that can then refer to the first one. And it makes me think of these altered states, that the other state you're in is not particularly interesting per se. It's just that now you have like a different vantage point to look back at your normal state.
Well, like Gödel's theorem thing, if I understand it correctly, which I probably don't, you could create a circular logic system which is, I think, self-consistent.
Yeah.
That'd be like self-referential and stuff. So you could make a language which is like that, I suppose.
But it wouldn't be complete. It would always have holes in it.
Sorry. No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
If you understand it better than I do, then chime in, because I am not.
Well, the trade-off is consistency or completeness. So you'll either be able to prove false statements as true. In other words, you'll run your logic engine and eventually it will give you falsehoods. Or there'll be sort of places on the map you just can't get to with logic.
And to be clear, you can have both inconsistency and incompleteness.
Right.
It's just that you can't have neither.
Right.
Is this completeness in terms of not also being self-referential, or like
The requirement has nothing to do with self-reference.
Oh.
The requirement is just constructible. You can have some kind of recurrence, even if it's not necessarily recurrence.
There'll be true statements you can't prove that are true.
I think there might be a reason to have multiple languages aside from having languages that can talk about other languages. If the no free lunch theorem applies to languages the same way it does algorithm, where you can only optimize certain features and you have to do that at the cost of other features,
right?
Then I'm at the point where I program in multiple languages. And so I'll write some Python, and then you can run like the Wolfram engine inside of Python. And so I'll do that, and then I'll run this R code, and then I'll run this other code for my database, because I can get a much more compressed representation of what I'm trying to do in a different language depending on what I'm trying to do.
Right, like Creoles.
Yeah, and I could see someone, I could see someone who was like a polyglot, who knew like 9 languages, being able to talk about things easier if they could just switch between all of their languages.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's very true.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, I've never had a hypothesis validated that quickly. That was great.
That's funny. I wonder though, actually, going to that, right? If there is a certain bit rate, a certain amount of compression, wouldn't that compression be a limitation of the brain or whatever the person speaking is? Doesn't that mean that someone who speaks 9 languages speaks them somehow worse?
You can get different compression indexes. So you're universal. So if what I'm talking about with the no free lunch theorem is true, this is part of something called algorithmic information theory.
Yes.
Which is the whole study of algorithms. There's a lot there. Y'all should go read the Wikipedia page. Fascinating stuff. But part of algorithmic information theory is different languages that you can represent algorithms in can compress different things at different rates, but the universal sort of compression index remains the same no matter what. That's part of the no free lunch theorem.
But at the end of the day, right, if this is true, if one thing is true here, right, this is an assumption, if you have to then transcode into some other language, then the compression rate, right, of that other language would be your fundamental limitation, wouldn't it?
Yes, I agree.
Whatever your internal language is.
I'm saying if you do like a Creole thing, like he can do apparently, or I do with coding languages, where you don't transcode it. You just say, all right, I'm going to say this sentence in this language, and then this sentence in this other language, and then this sentence in this other language.
But then ultimately, like, the runtime increases, if you will.
Yeah.
Does the runtime in your brain increase, and does that cause a limitation? When you have more languages, that means you have to have more interpreters.
Maybe it all evens out.
I don't know.
So with these large language models that can translate between all the major human languages, there's this idea of like a word vector, that it's actually representing concepts like apples and tables and beef jerky in like this weird space, and then when you try to translate it, it finds like the closest in whatever language you're looking for. I think it'd be interesting if we could go and look at those vector spaces, and as things like the lost language of paradise, are they in there? Right? Can we go back in like sort of the Tower of Babel kind of sense? Can we teach it every language on the planet? And then have it slime like this, like pure,
What that boundary looks like is actually kind of interesting. Like, that's some of the stuff I'm working on.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know how much of it is inherent to the problem and how much of it is just can't find a stable solution. But it's a little chaotic. I mean, it is chaotic.
I have a whole thing, and I won't get into it fully here, but there's a video getting uploaded on his channel where I talk about some of this, but I think that vector and that sort of hyperdimensional representation can represent language, but it can't represent knowledge. And so I'll put that here, and then we can get back to talking about whatever this is.
Yeah.
And if you're watching this video in the future, I guess you should watch the other videos.
I think I'm interested though about the way that we use these minimal representations or models to control things, right? So let's say you're in a car, right? You don't necessarily have to know how every aspect of the car works to use the car. If you're in an automatic, okay, you put your foot on the gas or the brake, you have the thing that goes into drive, park, whatever, and then the steering wheel. And that's basically it in order to move the car. But what is interesting though, is that as you're trying to test the car more, right, and test it under different contexts and circumstances, you will start to have to learn more in order to maintain the use of that car, right? And it's as simple as, okay, well, you want to keep pushing your car for longer distances, you're going to have to start to learn a little bit of how the engine and the transmission works if you don't want it to break down. It could be as simple as, you're trying to go drift, And eventually your tires will wear out, and you have to learn about a little bit, at least, about how the tires and the rims and whatever works, and how to replace that. And as you test a system more and more, it's like you're getting to know more. It's like testing is measuring and identifying different aspects of the system, right? And so I wonder what that looks like for language, the way that we test language, right? How do we use language? It's like saying, like, you know, why is it we can even say there is an unknown unknown? We don't actually have that in front of us, but we can say there is an unknown unknown, and we kind of know what it means, what it represents. Why is that?
Sofia Vergara, I watched an interview with her that she was in, right? And she said that a lot of times when she speaks in English, she doesn't really know that what she's saying is correct or incorrect. She just waits for the other person's facial expression and body language to tell her if she got it right or not. But in a lot of ways, she said that sometimes she doesn't even know what she just said, and she's just waiting for, like, the feedback.
But is that always true?
Yeah.
Are we always doing that to some extent?
Maybe to some degree.
Does it matter how good you are at reading that feedback?
I mean, think of how useful it is. They talk about in computer programming, the rubber duck debugging. When you have a problem with computer code, you just, like, explain your code to a rubber duck. Because just the act of verbalizing it, like 9 out of 10 times, can help you solve that problem.
Yeah.
So maybe it's like we're all kind of on that scale, that we're making up stuff and then we have to hear it ourselves to even know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all look for feedback also to sort of validate that we got our point across, even before the other person says if they got it or not.
But even from ourselves, in a sense.
Yeah.
I think in my experience, a lot of the time, it doesn't go across.
Yeah.
And I'll either misread feedback or get feedback that says it did go across, and what went across was completely different.
Yeah, because you have to be able to interpret and understand what the reward or the feedback is, the reward, the punishment, the feedback, whatever it is, right?
Well, do you ever witness a misunderstanding?
Yes.
Someone says something and someone else heard something, and you could perceive that, like, no, they didn't hear the right thing, right? How often does that happen to you, but you didn't notice?
Probably all the time.
Nonstop. Right. Probably most of the time in some weird sense, right?
Yeah.
I also think we misuse words probably a lot more than we recognize, because I'll notice other people using a word that's similar but not actually the right word, and you know, I notice it, I just don't say anything. So I'm assuming that other people recognize when I do it and they just don't say anything. But it's still, because they still got the point, they still got the idea based on the context. And
when I catch something like that, I tend to point it out because I'm concerned that I misunderstood. Because a lot of the time there's just a huge misunderstanding there. Sometimes it's
Do you think there are circumstances where a misunderstanding is a good thing?
Yes.
There you go.
Described it.
Maybe ambiguity.
Yeah.
Maybe not misunderstanding, but ambiguity.
Ambiguity is a good thing.
Yeah.
Ambiguity is kind of a necessary feature for languages to be useful for compression, because the number of symbols you have to describe a thing have to be less than the total number of things you want to describe about a thing, or else it's not useful.
But also from like a functional perspective, ambiguity is what leads to new things.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, Hilbert said, when rigor enters, meaning is lost.
Yeah.
But it's the flexibility in our understanding which actually weirdly supports the meaning. Right?
Well, that's how a lot of advertising works.
Yeah.
So a lot of times it'll be something controversial, but only the people who recognize it and get it, like
it's like an inside joke.
Would get it, and then anyone else wouldn't really recognize that it was maybe edgy or different, and like conceptually not what it looks like.
Yeah, look at like Alice in Wonderland.
Or look at our conversation today. If somebody who wasn't in the know walked in and heard all this. Same thing. I made a joke at Mindfest last year. I said if somebody walked in and heard us talking about all this stuff, they'd think we all just took a giant edible and started. That sound like you were there.
Oh, that's what the chomps are.
Yeah, that's the. Oh, they figured it out. Still sponsors. Anyway, but yeah, it is kind of interesting though, right? Like, I think, and this is why, like, the arts in general, I think, at least on sort of, they keep it less in the background in the zeitgeist in the sense, right? But you know, people, you know, as an artist, you're often said, okay, you should try to look at things in different ways constantly, right? Like when you're like, if you're making a song, you don't want every single track to be exactly the same. Maybe you'll have some pattern, but a lot of the time as an exercise for building your skills, whether it's drawing, painting, producing an instrumental, whatever, you're supposed to keep changing it up each time, right? And so like an artist, a normal, somebody who's maybe a little bit more into, more rigidly describing things would have a very specific way of describing that bottle. The artist would talk about all the other different ways it could be represented, and then maybe try to find a connection between those representations, right? So I think it's interesting when you think about the way you represent information and its ambiguity, right? I think, have any of you tried to like listen to like white noise and try to hear a sound or a song or a beat inside of it?
Well, what about like those SpongeBob repeating a sentence, like a sound for 10 hours and actually start hearing words?
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And it's the same thing as also being able to, look at clouds and see faces, or you're looking at like the particles on the, or all the little tiny stones and rocks and whatever on the ground and these tiny things, and seeing, you can shape it out. Like, right, if you look at like the cloth on your clothes or whatever, if you try hard enough, you can start to see, okay, that's a circle. I can see a triangle. And if you get really good at this, you can start to almost see a face.
So the chomps are kicking in.
yes. But there's actually something called casina or fire casina meditation or something, right? So people will say they'll look at this very kind of dim candle, or they will look at something and then focus on the after image, and under those phosphenes and those dots and things that they're seeing, when their eyes are closed, they'll try to eventually spend a bunch of time to construct this into like a very vivid real life image, right? And I think it's the same thing with how the way your mind is processing ambiguity and the white noise or the SpongeBob, voice thing, right? And it's also interesting that like as something repeats, you start to hear it less, right? And something fun to try would be like, all right, let's say you put on a thing of white noise right now, right? And like, what naturally sticks out to you based on the setting you're in right now? And then what else can you induce out of that? Has anybody tried that before?
I've tried it with visual white noise.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of a prisoner's theater?
I've done that.
It's where you place like a slightly crinkled piece of paper in front of your eyes and you just lay down without anything else.
You can do that with golf balls, right? When you cut the thing, I think you can do it. Or ping pong ball, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
This kind of reminds me of like when some people close their eyes, they see images
Yeah.
that aren't there.
I think it's worth our attention to figure out why it is you can create these experiences out of things that we consider to be kind of ambiguous. Because, when you're coming into the world for the first time, a lot of this stuff is going to be ambiguous too. Mm-hmm. Right? Is your sense of self ambiguous?
You had to learn it.
How do you learn it? And how do you even know what is a reward or feedback? Yeah, and do you have to have that sense of self to separate yourself from the object in front of you? Because in a sense, you have to know where your boundary is to know where the other thing is. And the other thing also defines where your boundary is. Like, remember, if you're using your eyes to see, you're not actually seeing your eyes directly. Right?
That was an interesting thing that Bruce Hood talks about in that video that I mentioned. It's called the self-illusion. And when your eyes move, when they saccade, they actually disconnect so that you don't get like a blurry streak. Yeah. And so that means when you think about how often your eyes are moving throughout the day, altogether, if you would add that time up, it's about 2.5 hours a day that you're effectively completely blind. Mm-hmm. But we don't notice this. We just we just fill that in. And the interesting example he gives, and you can try this later, go look in the bathroom mirror and look at one eye and then look at the other eye.
Yeah.
And then look back at the first eye. You don't see your eyes move.
Yeah.
Your perception just goes from one eye steady to the other eye steady.
Yeah.
But then go watch someone else do this, watch as a spectator, and you'll see their eyes move, no problem, as they switch from looking at one eye to the other. And it's just really neat that we don't perceive that at all.
Or do it like with your phone and take a video of it.
Yeah.
If your phone's like video rate is fast enough.
Video.
That's wild.
So it's 2.5 hours every day that we're completely disconnected from reality, but we're just in paints. This like illusion of
When you
continuity.
say disconnected, you're talking about visually disconnected from reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the signals just turn off, right?
What's interesting is there's an alternate way, and I think like reptiles or something do it, where you can have when you saccade, one eye move and not the other. And then the other moves, and that way you can stay connected. But we don't. Humans don't. Iguanas do that?
Or chameleons. I think it's chameleons, actually. It's one of the reptiles, though.
Yeah.
One of the ones with legs, not a snake.
That narrows it down.
It reminds me they put a camera on a chicken's head and then like put it on like a boat.
Yeah, yeah.
And like the chicken's head is incredibly stabilized, right? The whole body moves, but the head just kind of stays.
Well, in a sense, to make use of things, you need to have a sense of continuity, right? You kind of are always doing that to string together when your hand is moving if you're here or whatever else, right?
But it's an illusion. The idea that you're the same person you were yesterday, that you'll be the same person tomorrow, these aren't really true, right?
I mean, the sense of self, there are like certain disorders that are characterized by a lack of it, but like what language do we even use to describe what your sense of self is today? And is there any way to compare that to what it would be next week? Because is there even a language to describe your sense of self?
It seems like English isn't that good for that.
How would it?
Is there a language that's good for that?
I don't know.
I think English is actually great for that. I'm so sorry I'm being so contrarian today.
No, this is perfect. This is perfect. This is what we need. This spices things up. Please, be as contrarian as you want.
I'm a defender of English because it's a lot of people hate on English, and a lot of the arguments people have for English is a lot of the same arguments people have against Python, like the programming language. They're like, it's only kind of all right at everything.
Yeah.
But I think that's the same thing that makes English really good, is it's extensible and customizable. So like we don't have words in English to talk about you lack a sense of self. But you can build that out really easily in English because the rules are so flexible, and you can't do that with more formal languages.
But that's not true.
It's harder. You can do it, but it's harder. But I could be like, I am going to make up a new word for my sense of self on this particular day, and not talking about my sense of self yesterday or tomorrow. And that word is bloop blop. And like I've just like carved myself out a new piece of English to use.
Doesn't German do that a lot? Well, not in that sense, but like constantly building longer and longer words.
German does it compositionally though. Which is, it's different and it's less useful, and that's how you end up with 27 syllable words in German. I think English's way of doing it, of saying, here's a word, here's a definition, I just made the word up.
Well, I like the extensibility idea. It's like the colon operator in fourth.
But what would the definition of bloop block be? Like, what would your definition for your sense of self on a specific day be, so that it's something that you understand the word, maybe someone else can even understand the word, and next week you know exactly what you meant when you said that?
What do you mean?
Like, if it's to refer back to, right, in terms of knowing what it means each week, then how do you know, can you define your sense of self with a string of words as a definition and then assign that to a word? Or do we just not have a way to describe a sense of self?
No, when I said bloop block, I mean in this current moment, my sense of self. But you could come up with another word for my sense of self.
But do you think other languages can't do that?
No, I think other languages can't do it as easy. They have to do it compositionally like German, which is not ideal because you end up with 27 syllable words and then your compression rate isn't great. Or it's really hard to define new vocabulary, from what I understand. Maybe you can correct me. And languages like Chinese, because there's so many rules that you have to work within, where English is pretty loosey-goosey.
So that was an example where you literally just said loosey-goosey. Like, we could do that with words.
Yeah.
You know, and kind of substantiate a new vocabulary.
That's synonym for flexible.
Yeah.
I'm not saying English is the only language that can do this.
No, I'm saying Russian, Italian, Spanish, it's doable. But the one thing though that English does have is it's a lot more flexible, although feels awkward with syntax. Like if you look at how English evolves, we see all sorts of weird things getting added into our syntax.
Oh yeah, this is the problem with having an extensible, customizable language. This is the same problem with Python, is like every Python library uses a slightly different syntax to get things done.
Python frustrates the living daylights out of me because it doesn't have a very extensible syntax.
Oh, well, I think it does actually.
Compared to something like...
Not like Lisp.
Or Forth.
Yeah.
Where the syntax is completely flexible.
Right, for a long time, it didn't have switch case. And you couldn't just add that. Whereas like a language like Forth, you could just kind of define that pretty quickly.
Or even JavaScript has a much more flexible syntax than Python.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the syntax that's flexible or like the system of types is very flexible.
No, even typed, it still has a more flexible syntax.
Do people think if human languages and machine languages will mix together? Or will they always just be totally separate things?
Well, I mean, if you look at like the user interface for, let's say, a website, isn't that like an intermediary between the machine language and the human language? Or maybe like, I guess if you were to, like what OpenAI is thinking about with AI agents, where you input your human speech and then it goes into the operating system through that intermediary. That is like, it's not a combination, well, yeah, it is a combination if you think of the whole thing, but it's an intermediary that creates it.
I think until the hardware is the same, they're going to have an intermediary though. And the hardware being the same. There's like a startup where you can run computing on cerebral organoids, and maybe we'll get there. But like, because the hardware is different, that means the machine language is different. And so like the machine language for a computer with the x86 processor is like some combination of something in assembly. And the machine language for humans is like some sort of electrical signals. Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to naturally have to have different abstracted high-level languages to work with those two types of hardware. And then, so yeah, I think you're always going to have to translate between them until we get, you know.
So in the Dune universe, there's no computers, right? And and they've trained humans to sort of do computation in their head. Do y'all think that's possible? Say we had a couple thousand years of economic motivation to do so. Would that be possible? Could we make human computers?
Would we want to?
The site would maybe just select for people who are good at that. Not sure if it could be trained.
If it was an economic reason, then the ones who couldn't do it would just die.
I think it might be possible to make some kind of drug which makes the brain extremely like plastic, and that you could do that and maybe do some stuff to optimize the like structure. I think it might be like technically possible, although doing so without like computers and technology would probably be intractably difficult, I guess.
Technically possible and incentivized are two different things.
Yeah.
Technically possible, yes. Incentivize, I think computers are already good at these more explicit types of computations. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll probably just continue down.
But think of humans doing like speed runs or something really technical or fine motor behavior.
There's a fundamental limitation to how humans scale. We have language as a huge bottleneck, versus computers is far easier to get around that bottleneck. Mm. It's easier to string chips together because we can just make them bigger. And obviously you still do have that interconnect bottleneck and things do have to actually be changed, but it's nowhere near as constricted as language.
Yeah, humans aren't anywhere close to the thermodynamic limit.
Here's just another example. Like imagine like ChatGPT or DeepSeek, and you told the programmers that you have to get that done in the basic computer language, right? An older language from popular in the 70s and 80s. It's theoretically possible, but the programmers would kind of pull their hair out. It's not an efficient way to do it. Mm-hmm. Do we think that natural languages are good enough? Like, are we going to see improvements in English and Spanish and French and Chinese and so on over the next 100 years?
Have there already been improvements in English from 100 years ago?
Right.
What do you mean improvements? There's huge changes in English,
yeah,
especially over the last...
Yeah, but not just genetic drift, like, is it...
More efficient.
Yeah, more efficient or more practical.
Look at modern English. It's shorter. We simplified grammar quite significantly.
You mean brain rot?
We're getting very close to getting rid of personal pronouns. We are using shorter symbols. Like, look at text speak.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right? We've reduced the reliance on certain punctuation and certain word order forms. We've actually made more use of changing the order of two words in order to have a form of emphasis. So, if you consider that improvements, then there's tons.
Definitely adaptations to the world that exists. I don't know, maybe improvements, but I think language always has to change for the ways the world is changing.
Netiquette wasn't a word 100 years ago, probably, and I didn't know it was like a definition word until I was doing it on the spelling bee this morning. But it's a word.
what's the word?
Netiquette. Like etiquette online.
Huh.
Netiquette.
Science wasn't a word till like 500 years ago.
That
Super
was
recent
called
in human
natural
history.
philosophy.
I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
But it's not an English word. That's a borrowed word. It was a word in Latin for a long time.
All of ours are. That's the nice thing about having an extensible, customizable language.
Not
You
all
can
of our
steal
words are
stuff.
borrowed words.
A lot of them.
Yeah, some like 74%, right?
But to the idea that English is sufficient enough, then why is it then when we look at medicine and law, right, 20% of that education is just going and learning Greek and Latin?
I think we can do like astronomically better than English. I think when we understand languages enough, we might be able to create like neural networks or AIs which will create better languages for us to use instead. And that'll be the future of languages.
Right.
Actually, what you were saying there is interesting because there is a large shift, at least in law, towards plain language. And there's, right, it's taken long enough, but now, at least in the US, courts are encouraging plain language. Supreme Court opinions are being written with more modern grammar. Use of Latin phrases is highly discouraged, and the amount of specialized terms of art is going down, which for the most part makes it more readable, although you still have the issue of specific things which now get generic terms and mean specific things.
The same thing is happening with, my dissertation works with anatomy ontologies, and the same thing is happening with anatomy ontologies in biology, so what we call different parts of organism's body. It's moving away, not to natural language, because you can't have natural language for some of these things really, but it's moving away from Latin to sort of its own language, and the language is compositional in such a way that I can say this thing is these 30 words, and you can kind of understand what I mean and where that's situated and what that means for its functioning.
Right. I thought this was an issue in brain science because you have all these terms that as a layperson you think are some sort of like rich, context or meaning behind it. But if you translate an anatomy textbook, it's like, oh, the seahorse and the peach pit and the almond and the black stuff and the outer rind. Like it sounds like a fourth grader's coloring book. And you realize like, oh wow, there's not a whole lot to this. They're just calling that the seahorse. And I think putting those into regular language would expose sort of the infant state that brain science is in, that we're still just kind of cataloging the shapes of things in a very childish way.
But it's also a problem because then it leads to misunderstanding, right? It's that ambiguity which allows more people to be able to get an understanding of it, but also creates a two-directional misunderstanding. Right, once people start say, reason to believe, right? Once that becomes a phrase that's drilled into you through your law school education, it starts to mean a series of specific elements that in plain English it just doesn't. Right? Versus when you say something like res ipsa, since to most people that doesn't mean anything. In fact, it just means it itself, the thing itself, right? It's from res ipsa loquitur, which means, right, the thing for itself speaks, literally translated. So that phrase doesn't mean anything to most people, so to associate that with a series of technical definitions and elements that need to be shown doesn't confuse people in the same way. I don't think that's present in, say, anatomy.
No, in anatomy that's still new words. It'll just be like the medullar cerebral peduncle or something like that, which still has a little bit of Latin, by the way, in a medulla, but it's more about choosing a good set of like base vocabulary and then composing meaning from that, and that's what human anatomy is not anywhere near it because doctors work with human anatomy, so you have to chase a whole other field besides science. But like Drosophila anatomy or fruit flies, or like macaque anatomy or zebrafish anatomy, which are all organisms used in science, are all moving away from Latin.
Because eventually we're going to need to describe things for which there are no words. You're just going to need some kind of other blueprint type mechanism.
It's strange.
There's too many pieces.
Seeing the death of registers,
It's like how you talk to like your teacher or a judge versus how you talk to your peers.
And in some languages, registers are very strict and very distinct.
Sure.
Right? So Korean has 7. And they're all distinct, and like the highest register is pretty much a different language. Which...
It's like cursive.
No.
It's not really being taught anymore.
It's not a matter of being taught. The registers are not being used.
Kids don't know cursive anymore.
That's true. But
They're also losing their spelling ability because of spell check.
Yeah, but that's not this. But those don't lose actual semantics, right? Linguistic register carries actual meaning. It carries meaning about a relationship, an opinion of a person, right? And that entire thing is getting lost.
Well, the relationships are changing.
Right. Is the language changing or the social structure is
The
changing?
social structure is changing.
Is
It's
it?
like, well, in Cambodia, they had the different levels of language as Korea, but then they had Pol Pot, and language changed. I mean, suddenly.
But what follows what? Is it that the social changes follow the linguistic changes, or the linguistic changes follow the social
I'd
ones?
say the social changes start first, and the language follows the social change.
But they're definitely going to be tightly coupled.
If you look at, say, language reform in the Soviet Union, though, we can clearly see an example of how changes in language created a change in societal views.
But wasn't the society ready for those changes?
Ready for them, but
Maybe demanding them.
Would the language have changed if society wasn't already actively in a state where it was about to change?
Well, this has been a great discussion.
Yes.
Thanks, Eddie, for kicking this off.
Of course.
Yeah, we're going to be joining us.
We're going to do more. We're going to cover more topics. I did want to get into the fermented cannabis discussion. That'll have to be for another one.